Hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 66 of Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things. I'm one of your co-hosts, Sean, here with my other co-host, Samuel. Samuel, how are you?
I'm great, Sean. How are you?
I had a moment where I about lost my shit the other day, and I want to get you early before your kid is old enough to do this. And just please, God, don't be this kind of parent. If you are this kind of parent, shame on you. This happens to me, I feel like it's got to be more often than the average person, but I feel like I always get stuck behind a parent who thinks it's super cute that their kid does adult things that they shouldn't be doing in public. And my examples of this, or I have two examples. The first one is when parents have their toddler pay for things, and the parent isn't thinking about the line of people behind them watching their child slowly hand money to the cash register. The change is made. They hand the money and the change back to the child. The child drops the coins, and the parent the whole time is just sitting there going, "Oh, that's so cute. Pay the cashier the money, Timmy." And I'm behind him knowing that if the child was just in the cart and the parent paid on their own, I would be out of there by now. And it drives me nuts. And it happened again yesterday at Costco. A simple, let me look at the receipt and then mark that you paid. And it took probably 6 times as long to get through that GD line because I had a stupid parent up front, like in the front, just wasting everybody's time. And I just want to get you early before you start to do this. It's not cute. You're inconsiderate in terms of everybody else's time, and think of others.
And that's a pretty good rant. I had two reactions. I'll go first with my genuine reaction, which is I understand exactly where you're coming from, and that type of thing would frustrate the hell out of me too. As a parent,
oh God,
just you wait until you have a kid who's like just on the border of being capable of doing something that's like actually kind of impressive, and it is very cute. So
I don't find it impressive.
Well, but that's the thing. You will be surprised by what will impress you, because it will go from, oh my God, this thing can't do anything, can barely move, can't keep its own head up. It can eat and poop and cry. And then they're taking their steps, they're putting words together, they're pushing buttons, they're recognizing things. Everything is cute. That being said, in public, when there are other people, that is an opportunity for you, the parent, to model to the child how to be considerate of others.
Don't waste people's time.
Yeah, don't waste other people's time. It's not cute to them. They're in a hurry. Anyway, my other reaction was when you first said having kids do adult things. I was like, where's this going? It was like, checking out online with usually like, I was behind this parent, and they're having their kid manage the return of their like marital aid at the store or whatever. It's like, take mommy's dildo back. Okay, yeah, like get the get it.
Yeah, that's way too adult.
I know, I'm just kidding. That's
took that at a
anyway. We could put a little,
strange way.
You could put that little MA restriction on this episode. Anyway, we're not here to talk about how children are awesome and terrible at the same time. We're here to talk about the latest edition in our H.P. Lovecraft short story review series. Today we're talking about The Thing on the Doorstep. What did you think of this one, Sean?
I'm coming to the realization that his stories that are told in the first person, like it's somebody retelling a story, I tend to not like them as much.
Okay.
Because, and this story to me is a prime example of why I'm not enjoying them. I feel like I get less detail and less information,
Okay.
which I think is the point of this kind of storytelling. The storyteller is also kind of in the dark on some things, and that gives you a certain flavor or an amuse-bouche when it comes to like the story itself. But in this story in particular, I think it's a disservice because there's so much that is hinted at
Mm-hmm.
in terms of what's going on. Oh gosh, what's the names? Ed and Edward
Edward
and
Edward Derby and Daniel Upton are the
yeah, and Daniel Upton. Dan is our narrator throughout. But Edward has a moment where, like, I want to know what he's doing in Maine, like looking for these stones in the middle of the forest.
Mhm.
I want to know what these cult like seances are that his wife Asenath is like conducting. And
Mhm.
there's so much that is hinted at, but you don't get a lot of detail. And I feel like recently the stories that we've read of his where there is no narrator, he goes into a lot more detail. And I really enjoyed those aspects of
Okay.
those stories. But what did you think? I mean, I'll say I liked it. It was good.
Yeah. Well, I liked it. I read it in complete disclosure. I have read this one before. I forgot that I had read it. It had been a while. Wasn't I think on my second read through, now I understand it is more memorable now. I might have just been reading it too quickly or for whatever reason the first time and then I didn't remember it. But I think there's some pretty memorable images in this, especially at the end. And just
Mm-hmm.
the idea it's of the story itself is creepy. We should probably do a quick recap, quick plot summary, but I'll give a long story short. I enjoyed it. I understand why you didn't. And I think that some of your critiques ring true to some of the criticisms that the story has received by others as well. And
It's not that I didn't like it. I liked it. I feel like it could have been better.
yeah, and I think that's roughly in line with some of the criticism that I was reading, where it's kind of a middle of the road story. It doesn't reach the heights of others. It's not as bad as it could be. I think it is helped by the fact that it's a pretty compelling, uh, pretty pretty compelling story from a like a just the mechanics of it, which we should
Mm-hmm.
probably dive into. So you've hinted at the two characters, the two main characters, Edward Derby and Daniel Upton. Upton is our narrator, and Upton kind of relates this story and hinting at kind of this shocking act of violence that he commits at the very beginning of the story. So you know that things are going to trend toward the strange and the violent. And he relates his childhood friend, he's significantly older. I think he's 8 years older than his
Mm-hmm.
friend Derby, but Derby was always very precocious and was writing poetry and was engaging in intellectual matters, and so they could connect and they had a shared interest in some of these things. And as they grew up, Upton kind of becomes more traditionally successful. He goes to Harvard, he becomes an architect, he's working in Arkham, fictional Arkham, Massachusetts. Derby is excuse me, a little bit more sheltered primarily by his parents. He eventually his mother dies, and that's a big shock to him. And he goes to college where he kind of falls in with this crowd of, how are they described, as decadents and esoterics or something like that. Kind of, you get the hint that these are kind of people who are experimenting with the occult. And among this group is this woman named Asenath Waite, who is described as a native of Innsmouth, Massachusetts, which, for those of you who are familiar with the work of H.P. Lovecraft, Innsmouth is the setting of the relatively well-known story Shadow over Innsmouth, and there's some fishy things going on with Asenath. And it's related that her father was a kind of well-known sorcerer type guy, and Asenath and Derby eventually become married. And over, I think it's a couple years, right, Sean, that
Yeah,
their marriage goes
the
on.
story takes place over like 3 years.
And you get the sense that Asenath is kind of domineering, very strong personality, and Derby, Edward Derby, the friend of the narrator, he starts to act strangely, and he is seen driving his wife's car when he had not learned how to drive. And sometimes he will disappear in the car, and then he'll be driven back by a chauffeur or a mechanic. There are a couple of conversations in which Derby kind of confides in Upton that his wife Asenath is doing some strange things, and it's almost implied that she is somehow either possessed by or overtly influenced by her father, the Ephraim Waite, this allegedly deceased sorcerer. And the story culminates with the kind of revelation that Ephraim, the father of the wife figure, has learned how to basically take over the body, transfer his soul into the body of another, and he did that with his wife. And then through his wife, he's doing that with Derby. And he kind of, what is it? Jaeger is the term from Pacific Rim.
Yeah. So Ephraim, Asenath's dad, possessed Asenath, and we get the idea that Ephraim's spirit or soul is now inside of his daughter.
Mm-hmm.
And he put Asenath's soul into his old body, which he then poisoned and killed. And now he's trying to, I think the whole concept is Asenath was upset that she wasn't a man.
Yeah.
So now we have Ephraim trying to possess a man.
Yeah. And they
That's the whole.
describe, I think it's implied kind of that Derby was selected because he was
Weak-minded.
Weak-minded, but also gifted and creative. And through the possession of Derby, Ephraim, Asenath / Ephraim, but really it's the soul of Ephraim, the father. He's going out as you mentioned, going out into the woods in Massachusetts and finding these old ruins and descending down into these subterranean chambers, and he sees horrible things. I think they drop a couple of hints at it's Shoggoths, which is a race of creatures from Lovecraft's mythos. And then you have Upton, the narrator, kind of becoming more and more aware of what's happening as Derby is kind of regaining control over his own mind and sharing with Upton what's happening, including there's a very fateful car ride where in the middle of the car ride, after
he gets
repossessed. And so this is something that can happen remotely. And then Upton has Derby committed to a sanatorium, hopefully, thinking he can recover after a particularly kind of manic episode where he shows up on the door, or he shows up to his house, and eventually, while he's in the sanatorium, he's repossessed. And Sean explained that when one soul takes over another soul, they switch places. And it turns out that Derby had murdered his wife and buried her in the basement. And, well, I should say the body of his wife. And when his body was repossessed by the soul of Ephraim, he awoke basically buried in the basement in his wife's decaying corpse. And it was in that guise that he appeared. He became the titular thing on the doorstep, and he knocked on the door using his telltale knock of 3 strokes and then a pause and then 2 more strokes. So Upton knows it was him.
Mm-hmm.
And he's handed a note, and he reads the note that explains all of these weird happenings, and it's at the thing on the doorstep, or his friend Derby's insistence, that he then goes to the sanatorium and shoots the body of Derby possessed by the soul of Ephraim. And that's how we round out our story.
And then we discover that the only way to truly end the cycle is to cremate the body.
Yeah, so he's trying to get the body cremated.
Yeah, and the story leaves off with Dan, our narrator, worried that as long as Edward's body remains uncremated, there is a potential of him now being possessed by Ephraim or whatever, however you want to pronounce the name. But yeah, like overall, good story.
Yeah. I mean,
but like I said, there's just so many instances throughout this where I'm like, you're hinting at things that would be so cool if you gave us more detail.
Yeah.
And he just flirts around all of those things that I think would be riveting.
Yeah, you could. This would be. Let me say, I wonder how the story would be if you had multiple perspectives. You had a series of chapters and maybe a couple of different point of view characters where you had Upton, then you had Derby, and maybe you ended with Asenath or Ephraim or somebody that kind of tied it all together. There's also mentioning of the cult. There's like a cult leader from England who comes over.
Hmm.
It's like mentioned. There's a couple of throwaway lines, and I thought that was going to go somewhere for a second, and so you could have maybe some examples of this experiment failing or something like that with these other potential figures. But the criticisms that I read are kind of in line with what you're saying, where it doesn't really have you don't get the cosmic horror aspect of it. It's really more of a just kind of uh, a creepy horror story about a sorcerer, and the cosmic stuff is really more hinted at. We don't get the details
Hmm.
of what they're doing. We don't. It's not like the Dunwich Horror, where you know that there's a cosmic entity that is directly involved and manipulating things and is just on the border of being brought into this world. Here, it's like, okay, so why was Ephraim trying to achieve immortality? Was it in order to open a gate? Did he need the special like magical abilities of Derby or somebody within that circle? What's going on there? You could have had that. I get
Yeah,
it.
the only references you really get are the fact that Edward, as a young man, was fascinated by the occult and the Necronomicon in particular. At Miskatonic University,
Yep.
he like studied the Necronomicon and a couple other occult documents,
Yeah.
and then that leads to his meeting of Asenath at one of these university like get-togethers. But yeah, I mean, it's the stuff that we want is kind of always on the periphery
Mm-hmm.
of this particular story, and I like it, and I feel like it would be a great adaptation. I mean, is
Well, there
Lovecraft open or public domain yet?
I believe so. I think that's why I was able to get like the free Kindle
Yeah.
edition.
Oh, that's
But
right. Yeah.
there was a very recent Hollywood adaptation. So 2022, a movie called Suitable Flesh was released, starring Heather Graham. Heather Graham is the only name that I knew when I read it for the first time, and then a couple of other just kind of working actors, and then Barbara Crampton, whose name was familiar, and I couldn't place it, so I dug into a little
Yeah.
more.
Not for me.
She starred in two earlier Lovecraft adaptations, The Reanimator and From Beyond.
Mhm.
I believe that's what it was. That were, I think, pretty well received. And she was kind of a well-known horror actress back in the 80s and 90s. Let's see. She was in Puppet Master, Chopping Mall, yeah, Reanimator and From Beyond, which I think both of those are based on Lovecraft. Yeah. And so that piqued my interest. I am interested in watching that adaptation. And then the other thing that jumped out to me was, well, there's another one of those radio theater adaptations of this. I think that you could be able to consume this similar to the Dunwich Horror as a
Radio show.
radio show. And then there's a bunch of connections to this story with not only obviously the expanded Cthulhu mythos. We get references to the Necronomicon, we get references to Innsmouth, we get references to
Skatonic.
Miskatonic, Arkham, Massachusetts, Azathoth, some of the Shoggoth creatures. But then you also have characters who are either who share names with, or I think it's more the case that you have later authors who reference characters from this story in their own works. So
Mhm.
you have, let's see, you have Fritz Lieber kind of wrote a story in 1966 that talks about the buildings designed by Daniel Upton. So he was an architect, and then Fritz Lieber's talking about the Miskatonic University buildings that were designed by Upton. Apparently, Upton is a family name from Salem, Massachusetts, which is one of the kind of fictional. Arkham is a fictionalized version of Salem. You have, let's see here. So a lot of people read in there are references to Robert E. Howard, Clark Ashton Smith, who are kind of authors within Lovecraft's orbit back when he was alive. And then a lot of people think that to a certain extent, the description of young Derby was based on Lovecraft as a child, like he being very sheltered, being somewhat precocious, and it's not a complete rip off of his own life, but there are some inspirations there, and I will I'll say that's something that I thought about as I was reading before doing some research on the story after I finished the short story. So there's a lot of fun connections here, even though the story itself is not as well regarded in the mythos.
Yeah, for the ending of our Lovecraft short story series, I don't know. This was up there. This was probably like my number 2.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, I think Dunwich Horror was my favorite out of these so
Okay.
far. Color Out of Space was good.
Mm-hmm.
Honestly, Call of Cthulhu might be last.
Yeah. Well,
on my list.
It really, it's one where
that was the only one that I came into this having read previously.
Well, I think we reserve the right to return to the H.P. Lovecraft works when we need to. I don't know when we're going to get the next season of Critical Role, Legend of Vox Machina. I think we're still waiting on release dates for some of the other fantasy products that we've been following, Rings of Power, etc. So there's tons of other short stories, and I think we could probably, if we have enough time, we could do something like Shadow over Innsmouth, which again, Innsmouth is referenced a lot in this one, and it's a fun one.
I just really want a full-fledged Hollywood adaptation. We know Guillermo del Toro was working on At the Mountains of Madness. I think it was 2021 or 22. He released something on his Instagram that was like a CGI like test footage for his movie that he was working on, but he's been working on it for like 10 to 12 years or something. So yeah, some test footage I don't think really means much, but it's at least a hopeful sign that we would get a good horror adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft. But
well, I'm not saying that we are at that level, because obviously we are not, but the X-Files had, I think it was I can't remember what numbered season it was, but they had, I think, 2 new seasons created within the past 10 years after kind of, ended the show in the decades ago. And that was, I think, done in large part because of the X-Files files, which was Kumail Nanjiani. He grew up as a huge X-Files fan. He kind of revisited the series and kind of really broke down a lot of the episodes and the myth arcs. And obviously, he's established on his own, but maybe what we need is more coverage of H.P. Lovecraft. Let's get H.P. Lovecraft trending. That's what the world needs right now, is Lovecraft. In this era of partisan politics and children holding up checkout lines, what we need more of is H.P. Lovecraft.
Next week, Sam and I are opening up some fantasy cookbooks, and we are going to create a fantasy meal, and we're going to record ourselves not cooking the meal, because that's ridiculous, but post having cooked meal, we will do a video, and we will show off our meals, talk about how we cooked it, the inspiration of the recipe from the cookbook that we will choose. And we just thought it'd be a fun little one-off thing. Currently on the Facebook group, and we shared it on our Facebook business post as well for Elves, Rings, and Nerdy Things, we have a poll going for which mead you would like me to make from the Elder Scrolls cookbook. I think currently Juniper Berry Mead is the number 1 at the moment. I voted for Nord Mead, but we have a couple other options. There's a traditional, there's Horning Brew Mead, a couple names that you should remember from Skyrim if you played that game. So we got that, and then we're still not ready to announce it yet, because we're not going to announce it until we know it's a sure thing. But we have a cool, hopefully 2-part episode coming around early March that we're excited about, and hopefully you will be excited about it when you hear about it as well.
Indeed. All right, Sean. Well, it's been fun to dip into the H.P. Lovecraft Cthulhu mythos with you. And like I said, we reserve the right to return, but we've got some other stuff that Sean has just outlined. So we will see you all next week when we go to our fantasy cookbooks, and this becomes a full-on cooking podcast somehow. All right, everybody. Bye then.